Selena, I think everyone in this room deserves to know the truth tonight.
Phoenix, what are you talking about? I don't understand.
I did what you were too ashamed to do yourself.
This has to be some kind of mistake.
No mistake, Selena. We're your parents. And we're finally here.
Shut up! I don't know either of you. Phoenix, you have to believe me. I don't know these two people at—
Enough! You told me your parents wouldn't be at this wedding. Tonight, I'm proving you lead.
60 pairs of eyes in that room turned toward her all at once, and not a single one of them looked away. What Selena didn't know yet was that this was only the first secret Phoenix had uncovered that week. The second one was still folded, waiting, inside a stranger's purse. My name is Phoenix Ellison. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life I believed exactly one thing about love. Build it honestly, board by board, nail by nail, and it will hold the weight of anything life puts on top of it. I was wrong about the boards. 3 weeks before my wedding, my fiancée looked me in the eye across our kitchen island and told me her parents would not be coming. "They're not people you need to know, Phoenix," she said, stirring cream into coffee she wasn't drinking. "They won't even be at the wedding." What she didn't know was that I had already met them. 200 miles southwest of our apartment, in a small ranch house near Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, sat a man and a woman who had no idea their daughter was getting married in 19 days. Selena thought she had buried that part of her life so deep nobody would ever find the shovel marks. She was wrong about that, too. And by the time she understood exactly what I had done about it, there would be no undoing it. Not at a head table for 200 guests, not under a chandelier 95 floors above Michigan Avenue. Before we get into this story, I want you to remember one thing. Sometimes the quietest man in the room already knows everything. Let me back up. I run Ellison Commercial Group, a real estate firm my father started with one leased office on Michigan Avenue and a handshake. We do build-to-suit deals now, warehouses and mixed-use towers, the kind of work where a signature on a Tuesday afternoon can be worth more than most people make in a year. I live in Lincoln Park, in a gray stone 3 blocks off the lake, close enough that on quiet nights I can hear the foghorns out past North Avenue Beach. My life, before all of this, had a rhythm to it. Up at 5:30, coffee black, a run along the lakefront path while the sky over the water turned from slate to pink. Work until the city lights came on across the loop. Sunday dinner in Hyde Park, no exceptions, not for 14 years. That last one mattered most. My father, Nolan, is 65, a man who wears a tie like other men wear armor, and who taught me the only rule that ever counted in our house. Don't ever let anybody under this roof carry something alone. My mother, Sophia, is 63, and her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon smells like collard greens simmering with smoked turkey, like cornbread just out of the oven, like a house that has never once run out of love to give away. My Uncle Orion shows up loud and unannounced every week, usually with an opinion nobody asked for and a laugh that rattles the windows. That house, that porch swing that's been creaking since before I was born. Betty next door leaning over the fence to trade church bazaar gossip. That was the ground I stood on. It never once shifted under me. I met Selena 3 years before that Kitchen Island conversation, at a fundraiser gala in the Gold Coast. She was 32, sharp in a way that photographed well, always in something tailored, hair falling straight and glossy past her shoulders. She laughed at something I said within the first 10 minutes, a real laugh, and I remember thinking, quietly, there it is. We dated for nearly 2 years before I proposed. Dinners in the West Loop, weekends up in Door County. The ordinary architecture of a life two people were building together, one Saturday at a time. I proposed on the promenade at Navy Pier, with the skyline behind her, with a ring that cost $42,000, and a speech I'd rewritten 11 times. She cried. I believed every tear. There were small things even then that I let slide past me, the way you let a hairline crack and a foundation slide past you. Noted, not yet acted on. Nights when I'd come home and find her thumb moving fast over her phone screen, and the screen going dark half a second before I reached the doorway. A folder of messages that emptied itself every few days, tidy as a hotel room nobody had stayed in. When I asked about her family, she gave me the same 4 sentences every time, polished smooth from repetition. My parents are toxic. I cut them off years ago. It's not something I talk about. Please don't ask me again. I respected that. I come from a family that believes in privacy the way we believe in grace before dinner. You don't force it, you let it come when it's ready. I told myself it was old pain. I told myself a lot of things that year, the way a patient man does when he isn't ready yet to look straight at what's right in front of him. Then came a Sunday dinner, 3 months before the wedding, when my Uncle Orion set his fork down mid-bite and asked the one question nobody else at that table had worked up the nerve to ask out loud. It was such a small question. 11 words. It would end up being the first crack in a dam that had been holding back a river for 3 years. I had no idea that somewhere 2 hours down Interstate 55, in a house with a hand-painted mailbox and photographs of a little girl in pigtails lining the hallway wall, 2 people were waiting, without knowing it yet, to change everything I thought I understood about the woman I was going to marry, and about how far a person will go to erase where they came from. Selena, baby, where's your family? Why don't we ever hear a name, see a photograph, nothing at all? My Uncle Orion asked it the way he asks everything, plainly, without malice, a fork of cornbread still halfway to his mouth. But the table went quiet the second the words landed. Even the porch swing outside seemed to stop its creaking, like the whole house was leaning in to hear the answer. Selena gave the smile she uses in board meetings, smooth, rehearsed, camera-ready. Like I've told Phoenix, we're not close. My parents are complicated people. I'd rather not revisit it at dinner. She reached for her wine glass. Her hand, just barely, was not quite steady. I noticed. I always notice things. It's the whole reason I'm good at my job. I read the fine print other people skip. My mother, Sophia, reached over and patted Selena's hand, gentle as a woman patting a child who's had a hard day at school. That's all right, sweetheart. Family's not always blood. You've got us now. The table moved on. Orion refilled his sweet tea. Nobody pushed. But later, out on the porch, my father caught my elbow before I could follow Selena to the car. Phoenix, Nolan doesn't waste words, not ever. You need to know what you're walking into, son. A person who won't say her mother's name out loud is either protecting herself from something or protecting a lie from you. I told him I'd handle it. I didn't know yet what handling it would actually require, or how much of what I thought I knew about my fiancée was about to come apart at the seams. It took me 4 days and a paralegal favor to find the address. Public property records, an old change of address filing, a high school yearbook archive from a district I'd never heard of. Peoria, Illinois, 200 miles southwest down Interstate 55. I told myself I was doing something generous. I was going to find Selena's parents, introduce myself, maybe soften whatever old wound had closed that door. I wanted to walk in and say, whatever happened, I'd like to help fix it. That was the whole plan. Fix it. Quietly. The way I fix everything. On the drive down, the flat Illinois farmland rolling past in long green stretches, I found myself thinking about the promotion I'd turned down 2 years earlier. Regional director, a corner office on the 31st floor, a number attached to it I still remember exactly. An extra $85,000 a year. I'd said no because Selena told me she was drowning that spring, that her family situation had flared up again, and she needed me present, not traveling 4 cities a week. I remember holding her while she cried about it. I remember feeling proud of myself for choosing her over a title. It never once occurred to me to ask what, exactly, I was choosing her over. Peoria surprised me. Tree-lined streets near Bradley University, small brick homes with basketball hoops bolted over garages, a downtown you could walk in 15 minutes, a river the color of pewter under a flat gray sky. It wasn't the kind of place I'd built up in my head, some vague, unnamed source of shame. It was just a town, ordinary, unhurried, decent. I found the address on a quiet street off Prospect Road. A modest ranch house, white siding, a mailbox somebody had hand-painted with sunflowers years ago and never repainted since. A man was out front, watering a bed of marigolds with a garden hose, moving slow and careful, the way men do when their knees have started keeping their own opinions. Late 60s, broad through the shoulders, even with age starting to round them. When I said her name, "I'm looking for Selena's family. I believe this may be the right address." His hand went slack. The hose dropped, water pooling across the sidewalk in a spreading dark stain. His face did something I've only seen a face do once or twice in my life. It cracked open with relief, like a door that's been swollen shut, finally giving way. "You know our Selena?" His voice broke clean in half on her name. His name was Landon. 62 years old, a retired postal worker, gentle in a way that made the whole porch feel like a place you could exhale in. His wife, Samara, came to the screen door wiping flour off her hands from something baking, and when she understood who I was, she pressed both palms flat over her mouth like she was trying to hold something in that had been trying to get out for years. Inside, the front hallway was lined floor to ceiling with photographs. Selena in pigtails on a tricycle, Selena in a graduation gown outside a high school gymnasium, Selena at maybe 7 years old asleep on Landon's chest on this same porch swing I was sitting on now. Samara made coffee with hands that trembled slightly around the mugs. They told me, quietly, without an ounce of bitterness aimed my way, that 11 years ago they'd offered Selena everything they had toward her first year of law school. $15,000, every dollar of Landon's early retirement savings. She'd taken it. And that same night, after a fight about whether it was enough, she'd blocked both their numbers. No calls, no visits, not once in 11 years. But every year or two, Samara said quietly, usually when she was in some kind of trouble, a letter would show up. Never a return address on the envelope. Asking for something, money, a signature, a favor. Then she'd go quiet again for another year or two. We always answered. We never once said no. Landon looked down at his hands when she said that, the way a man looks at his hands when there's nothing left in them to offer, and he's still ashamed of it anyway. I was sitting in their small kitchen, a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, when my phone lit up on the table. Selena. "Babe, my parents just called and apologized. They want to meet you for lunch tomorrow." Finally, I'm so happy right now. I looked at that message for a long moment. Then I looked up. At Landon, drying his eyes with a dish towel. At Samara, still holding her coffee mug in both hands like it was the only warm thing left in the world. I was sitting, at that exact second, in the kitchen of the only parents Selena had. And she was telling me some other set of parents was about to walk into my life tomorrow at noon. Something cold moved through my chest, quiet and total, like a light switching off in a room I hadn't realized was still lit. I want to tell you I confronted her that night. I didn't. Some men, when the floor cracks beneath them, go looking for the nearest thing to hold on to and swing. I am not that kind of man. I drove home in silence, turned the radio off somewhere around Bloomington, and by the time the Chicago skyline came up gray and glittering against the night sky, I had already decided something else entirely. Selena was still out with friends when I got back to the apartment. I told myself I was just looking for a phone charger in the desk drawer of the home office we shared. That's not entirely true, and I won't pretend it is. What I found, tucked inside an old file folder behind a stack of takeout menus, was a printed wire transfer receipt, 7 months old. $12,000, moved from the joint account she'd told me was strictly for a specialist in Nashville, for a diagnosis she'd sworn me to secrecy about. The destination account on that receipt belonged to a name I didn't recognize at all. Not a hospital, not Nashville, not anything close to what she'd told me. I folded it once, then again, and put it in my jacket pocket without a word to anyone. I called my father from the car. "Dad," I said, "I need you to help me put together a real dinner." He didn't ask why. He just said, "Name the night." Phoenix just found proof his fiancée is lying, and said nothing. Team A, he should have confronted her that same night. Team B, staying quiet was the smarter move. Pick one. Comment it below before you keep reading. What happened at that lunch the next day would turn out to be only the beginning, because the woman Selena was about to introduce as her mother had never given birth to a single child in her life. The restaurant Selena picked for the lunch was a place on Rush Street in the Gold Coast, the kind with white tablecloths ironed so crisp they could cut paper, and a maitre d' who says your name like he's known you for years. I got there first. I always get there first. It's a habit my father drilled into me before I was old enough to drive. The man who arrives early controls the room, not the man who walks in trying to catch up. Selena arrived 12 minutes late, glowing, radiant in a way I hadn't seen in months, holding the arm of a tall, silver-haired man in a suit that had clearly never once seen a department store rack. Behind him came a woman, elegant, poised, a strand of pearls at her throat, moving like every room she entered had been built to receive her. "Phoenix," Selena said, breathless. "I want you to finally meet my parents, Liam and Freya." I stood and shook Liam's hand. His grip was firm, careful, the handshake of a man who has spent decades in rooms where a handshake is the first item on a negotiation. Freya took both my hands in hers, and her eyes went bright and wet almost immediately. "We've waited so long for this," she said. "So long." Her perfume was expensive, subtle, the kind that doesn't announce itself, and her rings caught the light every time she gestured, which was often. There was something almost theatrical in how completely she'd committed to the role of a doting mother meeting her daughter's future husband, and something else, underneath it, that felt entirely sincere. I couldn't yet tell which part of her was performance and which part was simply grief, wearing its Sunday best. We sat. A server in a black vest poured sparkling water without being asked, then wine a moment later. Selena talked more in that first 15 minutes than I'd heard her talk in the previous 15 months. Funny stories, she said, were from her childhood. A Christmas in Winnetka with too much snow to get the car out of the driveway. A graduation party on a lake house deck with sparklers and a bonfire. Freya laughed at all the right places, soft and delighted. The laugh of a woman who has told herself these stories so many times she no longer remembers they aren't hers. I watched Liam's face while Selena talked. There was something in it I couldn't place at first. Not pride exactly. Something closer to grief wearing pride's clothing, worn so long The seams had started to feel like skin. Halfway through the entrees, over a lull in Selena's stories, Liam set down his fork and looked at me directly. "I'll tell you something, Phoenix. Man to man." His voice dropped, quieter, meant for me and not for the table. "About 4 months ago, I hired a private investigator to look into some details of Selena's story. Little things weren't adding up. Dates, names of schools, a birthday she gave Freya once that didn't match one she gave me. I had a full report sitting on my desk for 11 days before I opened it." Freya's hand found the edge of the tablecloth and gripped it. "And I never read past the first page," Liam said. "Because we lost our daughter 9 years ago. Car accident on 294, a Tuesday morning, and there hasn't been a single day since where the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for her to come back through the door. When Selena came into our lives, when she called Freya Mom for the first time, I made a decision. I decided I would rather have a daughter who might be lying to me than an empty house that definitely wasn't." Liam wasn't confessing a mistake, he was confessing a bargain. His true motive was never blindness, it was hunger. The specific hunger of a man who still sets a 5th plate at Thanksgiving out of habit. His deepest fear was an empty house that finally admitted it would stay empty forever. So when Selena offered him a daughter's laugh, even one he half suspected was borrowed, he chose her on purpose, weighing the risk of being deceived against the unbearable weight of a chair nobody would ever sit in again. And at 2 in the morning, grief always won that argument. I sat with that for a moment, the way you sit with a gut punch you're not ready to let show on your face. My own hand tightened, just slightly, around my water glass. Because while Liam spoke about the report he never finished reading, I was remembering something of my own. The 18 months I'd spent wiring money to an account Selena swore was for her family, under strict instructions never to mention it to anyone, not even my own parents. I was remembering the promotion I'd waved off, the nights I'd canceled with clients because Selena needed me home for family reasons. I had built sacrifices on a foundation too. Mine just hadn't finished cracking yet. Not out loud, anyway. "She's been the best thing that's happened to us since we lost Marisol," Freya said, dabbing at the corner of one eye with a linen napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. "I know that probably sounds strange to hear from someone you just met." "It doesn't sound strange at all," I said, and I meant it, even with everything sitting cold and heavy in my jacket pocket, where I still carried that wire transfer receipt I'd found in my own home office 2 nights earlier. Because grief makes reasonable people build unreasonable houses. I understood that better than I wanted to admit. My fiancée reached under the table and found my hand, laced her fingers through mine, gave it a squeeze that felt, to anyone watching, like pure happiness. "Isn't this everything you wanted?" she whispered. "A real family, finally, all together?" I smiled at her. I want to be honest, it wasn't a hard smile to produce. Some part of me still wanted the version of this story where everyone at that table got to keep what they thought they had. For a moment, sitting there with the afternoon light falling warm through the tall windows onto Rush Street, I let myself imagine it. A simpler version of this story where I'd never driven to Peoria, never found that hand-painted mailbox, never sat across from Samara watching her hands shake around a coffee mug she couldn't quite bring herself to set down. In that version, Liam and Freya really were Selena's parents, grief and joy tangled together into something clean and whole. And I got to marry a woman whose past actually matched the stories she told at dinner parties. I let that version breathe in my chest for exactly as long as it took the waiter to clear our plates. Then I let it go. A man can't build a life on a blueprint he already knows is false, no matter how badly he wants the easier version. "I have an idea," I said, out loud now to the whole table. "Let's do this properly. An engagement dinner. Not some quiet lunch on Rush Street, but a real celebration. The Signature Room's events director has owed my father a favor since a lease deal we closed for them 3 years back, so I can have the 95th floor next Saturday evening. I want to stand up in front of everyone who matters and introduce the people who raised the woman I love. Freya's hand went to her chest. Liam nodded slowly, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. And Selena's whole face opened up like a window, catching morning light for the first time in years. She squeezed my hand again, harder this time, eyes shining. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, exactly that. Let's finally do this right." I smiled back at her, warm and steady, the same smile I'd been giving her for 3 years. But behind it, quietly, a different thought was taking shape, one I kept entirely to myself. She thought she had just won something enormous. What she didn't know yet was that she had just walked, smiling, straight into the exact evening I was already building, one guest list at a time. That night, I called my mother. I asked her to set 2 extra places at a table that hadn't been booked yet, for 2 people Selena had spent 11 years pretending didn't exist. I didn't tell her everything. I only told her enough. "Saturday," I said, "95th floor, and Mom, wear something you'd wear to church. This one matters." She didn't ask why, either. Ellisons don't, when it counts. What none of us knew yet, not Liam, not Freya, not even me, sitting there so sure I finally had the whole picture, was that the letter, already folded inside Samara's purse back in Peoria, would turn out to be the smallest piece of what Selena had been hiding. The Signature Room sits on the 95th floor of the old Hancock Building on North Michigan Avenue, and on a clear night, the whole city spreads out below the windows like something laid out on purpose just for you. 60 guests, white orchids on every table, a quartet playing something soft near the bar. I'd planned every detail of that room myself, down to the seating chart, and by 7:30 it was full. My parents, my Uncle Orion in a suit he clearly hated wearing, colleagues, old friends, and at the head table, Liam and Freya, glowing under the low gold light, playing the parts they'd been playing for going on 2 years now. I had spent the better part of that week rehearsing this moment in my head, while I sat in my office on the 31st floor, staring out at the same skyline this room now looked down on from twice the height. I thought about my fiancée, how she'd squeezed my hand at that lunch on Rush Street and whispered, "Isn't this everything you wanted?" And how, in a strange way, she wasn't wrong. I had wanted the truth laid out in front of everyone who loved me. I just don't think she understood back then how completely that truth would include her. I stood and I tapped my glass with a fork. The sound rang out clean over the low hum of conversation, and the room quieted the way rooms do when someone with a full glass and a straight back gets ready to say something that matters. "Thank you all for being here," I began. "In my family, we were raised to believe in one thing above almost everything else: the truth. My father taught me that a family that can't be honest with each other isn't really a family at all, just people sharing a roof." I let that sit a beat. Tonight, I wanted to make sure the right people were in this room to hear that. I nodded once toward the side door. It opened, and Landon walked through first, in a suit that was a decade old but pressed sharp enough to cut glass, his shoulders back the way a man stands when he's decided, finally, that he has nothing left to be ashamed of. Behind him came Samara, in a modest burgundy dress, her hands folded in front of her, eyes already glassy under the chandelier light. Selena's face lost every ounce of color at once. The champagne flute in her hand tipped, hard, and a thin gold stream ran across the white linen before anyone thought to write it. "Phoenix," her voice cracked apart mid-syllable. "There's some kind of misunderstanding." Liam stood before she could finish the sentence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The whole room had already gone still enough to hear a pin land on carpet. Freya's hand rose slowly to her throat. To the pearls she'd worn, I understood now, the way a woman wears armor rather than jewelry. "We lost our daughter 9 years ago," he said, looking directly at Selena, each word landing slow and deliberate. Marisol was 24. A Tuesday morning, a patch of black ice on 294, and gone before the paramedics even got her out of the car. I have spent 9 years walking past her bedroom door without opening it. His voice caught just once, and he let it. "And you took that grief, and you built an entire stage on top of it. You learned exactly which stories would make Freya's eyes light up. You learned my daughter's laugh from an old video, and you practiced it in a mirror somewhere, I have to assume, because you got it close enough to fool 2 people who should have known better." He turned briefly toward Landon and Samara, and something in his face cracked open. Recognition, maybe, or shame at how long he'd let himself look away from what he already half knew. "I'm sorry," he said to them, and his voice, for the first time all evening, sounded like an old man's voice instead of a courtroom voice. "I should have finished reading that report the day it landed on my desk. I owed you that much, and I owed my own daughter's memory more than what I gave her tonight." Around the room, 60 guests sat frozen mid-motion, a fork halfway to a mouth, a hand stalled over a water glass. The quartet near the bar finally faltering into silence, as even the musicians realized something was happening that music couldn't sit underneath anymore. Somewhere behind Selena's frozen expression, a much younger fear was still running the whole operation. The terror of ever again being the girl from the ranch house on Prospect Road, the one whose parents could only offer $15,000 toward a future that needed so much more. What she actually wanted was never Phoenix, not really. It was the version of herself his last name and his family's table seemed to promise. She hadn't set out, at first, to hurt anyone. She'd set out to disappear into a better story, one polished floor at a time, torn every single day between the daughter she used to be and the woman she'd built to replace her. And she had simply never found a moment brave enough to stop before the two collided in front of 60 witnesses. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the folded wire transfer receipt I'd been carrying since that night in my own home office, and set it down, gently, no theater to it at all, on the white linen in front of her. "Nashville," I said quietly. $12,000, 7 months ago. I think you remember that account a lot better than you'd like me to know." Selena stared at the paper like it might vanish if she didn't look at it too long. Then, without a word, she reached up with a hand that wasn't steady at all, slid the ring from her finger, and set it down on the linen beside the receipt. It rattled once against the white cloth before it went still. The only sound in that whole enormous room. "I'm not asking for it back because I want it back," I said. "I'm asking because I think you already understand what it means to give it up." Samara stepped forward then, her hands shaking as she opened a small clutch purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from being read and reread. "This came 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice breaking on nearly every word. "I want everyone to hear it, because I've carried it alone long enough." She read it, her daughter's handwriting. A letter asking for $4,000 more, closing with a line that landed on that room like a stone dropped into still water. "Please don't tell Phoenix. He wouldn't understand. I'm already putting things in place to leave after the wedding." For one long moment, nobody in that room moved. 60 people, absolutely silent. 95 floors above the city, every one of them staring at the same small piece of paper in Samara's shaking hands. Somewhere behind me, I heard my Uncle Orion mutter something low under his breath, and my father's hand landed firm and steady on my shoulder, the same way it had landed there my whole life, at every moment that mattered. I felt something in my chest, not the sharp thing I expected, the thing you brace for. Something quieter. A door finally closing all the way, instead of hanging open the way it had for months. Samara pressed both hands over her mouth, and the sob that came out of her was low and raw. The sound of a mother who has spent 11 years grieving a daughter who was, this whole time, still very much alive and simply ashamed of her. I picked up the tall centerpiece of white orchids from the head table and carried it to her, set it gently in her arms like you'd hand someone something breakable. She loved you once, I told her. I believe that. I think, somewhere in her, she still does. Samara held the flowers against her chest and nodded, unable to speak. She used to, she whispered finally, so quiet only I caught it. Before she found people with more money than us. Before she asked us to please not embarrass her in front of them. I looked at Selena one last time. She sat frozen at the head table, mascara starting to track down one cheek, 60 faces turned toward her, not one of them softening. You won, I told her, calm, no anger left in my voice at all. You don't have to perform anymore, not for me, not for anyone in this room. Then I turned, offered my arm to my mother, and gathered both families, the Ellisons and the Bennetts, mine by blood and theirs by a truth finally spoken out loud, and walked them toward the elevator. Behind us, the door to the private dining room swung shut on its own weight, closing soft and final as a held breath finally released. Selena sat alone at a table built for 200 well-wishers, under a chandelier bright enough to make sure absolutely everyone could see her. And for the first time in longer than she could probably remember, there was no one left in the room willing to look away and pretend for her. What none of us realized yet was that the hardest reckoning of that night hadn't happened inside that room at all. It was waiting for me in a text message I hadn't opened, sitting quiet on my phone the whole time. Outside on the sidewalk along Michigan Avenue, the wind coming off Lake Michigan had picked up, cool and steady, carrying that particular late evening smell the city gets near the water. Traffic moved past in long red streaks of brake lights. Nobody said much for the first minute or two. Sometimes silence after a storm is its own kind of conversation. My father was the one who broke it. He walked straight up to Landon, put out his hand, and said, plain and unadorned the way he says everything that matters, "Nolan Ellison, I'm sorry it took this long for us to meet. You should have been at that table from the very first Sunday dinner." Landon shook his hand, and something in his shoulders came down an inch, like a weight he'd been carrying since a phone call 11 years ago had finally been set on the ground. "Landon Bennett," he said. "Wish we'd met on better terms. Glad we met at all." My mother didn't wait for an introduction. She simply walked to Samara, still holding that armful of white orchids against her chest, and wrapped both arms around her the way she hugs everyone she's decided to love. Completely. No half measures. Samara's shoulders shook once, twice, and then she let herself be held by a stranger who felt, within about 4 seconds, like she wasn't a stranger at all. The two families stood there on that sidewalk for a long while, coats buttoned against the wind, talking the way people talk when the performance is finally over and there's nothing left to do but be honest. About children, about the ways families disappoint each other and still show up anyway. About how strange it is that two mothers who'd never met could already understand each other completely. My Uncle Orion, of all people, ended up telling Landon a long story about a fishing trip gone wrong on the Illinois River. And Landon laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere old, somewhere that hadn't been used in a while. Samara finally set the orchids down on a low concrete planter by the building entrance and took both of my mother's hands in hers. "I want you to know," she said, "that our girl wasn't always like this. She used to write us letters from her dorm room, silly little things, drawings in the margins. Something happened to her along the way. Some idea that love had to be earned with the right zip code, the right last name at the door. I don't know exactly when we lost her to that idea. I just know we did." My mother didn't offer any easy comfort, no false promise that everything would mend itself neatly. She just held Samara's hands a little tighter and said, "Then we'll be the family that shows her something different, starting now, whether she's ready for it or not." That's the kind of woman my mother is. She doesn't wait to be asked before she starts loving somebody. I sat alone in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine, letting the heater run, watching my breath fog faintly against the cold glass. My phone buzzed against the console, a text from my mother. "Son, I need to tell you something. I've been holding on to a voice memo Selena left me 8 months ago. She asked me not to mention certain things to you, said you'd worry, said you'd get in the way. I think you should hear it when you're ready." I read that message twice. Even now, even after everything I'd already uncovered, there was still a part of me that could be surprised. That the deception had reached far enough to include my own mother, quietly, patiently, for the better part of a year. I didn't play it that night. Some things, I've learned, deserve to be heard with your whole family in the room, not alone in a parked car on North Michigan Avenue at 11 o'clock at night. Back inside the private dining room we'd left behind, I heard later, Selena sat by herself for nearly 20 minutes before anyone moved her. Liam and Freya left without another word to her. Not cold exactly, just finished. The way people are finished with a story once they've read its final page. A few of her friends had lingered near the bar, and not one of them crossed the room to sit beside her. Nobody consoled her. Nobody reached for her hand the way she'd reached for mine so many times, expecting it to always be there. That's the part of this story I still think about most, more than the letter, more than the ring on the linen. Not the moment of exposure itself, but the 20 minutes after. 60 people who had spent an entire evening in her orbit, and not a single one of them willing to sit with her once the lights came up on what she really was. I didn't look back before the elevator doors closed. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly what I'd find if I did. A woman sitting very still, under a chandelier bright enough to see everything by. Finally alone, with no audience left to perform for. Driving home along the drive, the lake black and enormous on my right, the skyline glittering behind me in the mirror, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel that night. Not triumph, not even relief, not yet. Just quiet. The particular quiet of a house after a long storm has finally passed through it, leaving the windows rattled, but the foundation, somehow, still standing. I thought about Landon watering marigolds on a Tuesday afternoon, about the $15,000 he'd given away without a second thought 11 years ago, about the particular way grief teaches a person to hold on to small, warm things, a coffee mug, a photograph, a name they're no longer allowed to say out loud at their own kitchen table. I thought about how some people spend their whole lives trying to outrun where they came from, never understanding that the people back home were never the thing worth escaping. I thought, too, about my fiancée, not the woman sitting alone under that chandelier, but the one I'd actually fallen for 3 years ago, laughing at a joke I told at a Gold Coast fundraiser. I wondered, driving home, whether that woman had ever really existed at all, or whether I'd simply been in love with the first honest thing she'd shown me, right before she buried it under everything that came after. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest part of this story, the truest part, was still waiting for me at my mother's kitchen table the following Sunday. The following Sunday, my mother's kitchen in Hyde Park smelled exactly the way it always smells. Collard greens simmering slow, cornbread cooling on a rack by the window, the porch swing outside creaking its same old rhythm against a mild afternoon breeze. Landon and Samara sat at our table this time, right where they belonged, Samara laughing at something Orion said before he'd even finished the punchline. For the first time in longer than I could remember, that dining room felt completely, entirely honest. After the plates were cleared, I set my phone on the table and looked at my mother. She nodded once. I pressed play on the voice memo. Selena's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, recorded 8 months earlier. Sophia, I just need Phoenix to stay steady until I make associate partner at Callaway. After that, I'll figure out how to transition out gently. There's someone else already, someone who actually gets what I'm building toward. Phoenix is sweet, but he's not it long term. Please don't say anything to him. He'll just worry and try to slow things down. Nobody at that table moved. My father's fork rested untouched against his plate. Every sacrifice I'd quietly made over 3 years lined itself up in my mind all at once. The promotion I'd turned down, the money I'd wired without question, the nights I'd canceled with people who mattered because Selena needed me present. And every single one of them settled into place as exactly what it had actually been the whole time. Not love asking for patience. A ladder, and I had simply been one more rung on it. I understood then, too, exactly where that Nashville money had really gone. Not to a specialist, not to any doctor at all, but toward an apartment in a name that wasn't mine. A second life she'd been quietly building for the day she was finally ready to walk into it. Samara began to cry, but it was a different sound than the one she'd made at that restaurant a week earlier. Softer, lighter, the sound of something finally exhaling after holding its breath for 11 years. Landon reached over and squeezed my shoulder once, a quiet nod passing between us that didn't need any words attached to it. My father set his hand on my other shoulder and said only, "You did the right thing, son. Every step of it." I sat there for a moment, waiting to feel the grief I expected, and it never quite arrived. What I felt instead was something closer to relief, clean and total, like setting down a bag I hadn't realized had grown so heavy. I hadn't lost Selena that night at the signature room. I'd simply stopped losing pieces of myself to a version of her that was never real to begin with. Dinner went on the way it always does in that house. Second helpings, Orion telling the fishing story again with new exaggerations. Betty from next door stopping by with a pie for no particular occasion at all, just because that's what Betty does. Landon and Samara are part of our Sunday table now, every week, no exceptions. Some Sundays, Samara brings her own cornbread recipe to compare against my mother's, and the two of them argue cheerfully about butter ratios like they've been doing it for 20 years instead of 2 months. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, that Selena moved out of state a few months later. I don't carry any anger about that anymore. I hope, honestly, that wherever she landed, she found a version of herself that didn't need a fabricated set of parents and a stolen last name to feel like she belonged somewhere. That's not forgiveness exactly. It's closer to setting a bag down at the side of the road and simply walking on without it. Landon retired fully from his postal route that spring. And my father, a man who has never in his life offered anyone a job out of pity, brought him on as a part-time consultant at Ellison Commercial Group, walking new hires through what decades of quiet, honest work actually looks like up close. Samara joined my mother's church group within a month, and the two of them can now be found most Saturdays at the community center on 53rd Street, running the dessert table at the bazaar together, like they've done it their whole lives. Landon still keeps that hand-painted mailbox out front of the Peoria house, sunflowers fading a little more every year, though these days there's almost always a car parked outside it that belongs to one of us. I got married 18 months later to a woman named Imani, who teaches middle school science on the South Side, and has never once, not in 3 years together, asked me to keep a single secret from anyone I love. At our wedding, Landon walked Samara down the aisle to their reserved seats himself. Both of them dressed sharp, both of them crying before the music had even started. My father gave a toast that mentioned honesty 4 separate times. Nobody in that room needed him to explain why it mattered so much. This story reminds us that the truth in a family almost never arrives with a bang. It waits quietly at the table until somebody finally asks the plain question out loud, the way my Uncle Orion did over cornbread. If you're widowed now, or the house has gone quieter than it used to be, try this instead of just wishing it felt easier. Tonight, before the kitchen light goes off, take down whatever chipped mug or cracked mixing bowl still sits on your shelf because it was theirs, set it on the table, and write one specific memory it holds in a 5-cent spiral notebook. Not "I miss him," but the actual Tuesday, the actual joke, the actual weather. Keep the notebook where you'll see it, not in a drawer. If a chair at your Sunday table has stayed empty longer than it should, invite the neighbor who only ever waves over the fence, the way our Betty always let herself in with a pie, and set a real plate, not a paper one. And if you're watching a grandson pour his heart into someone who won't say her own mother's name out loud at your dinner table, ask her plainly, once, the way Orion did, and then wait. Grief doesn't need a speech. It needs someone willing to sit at your table at 7 o'clock and simply not leave early. And when truth finally costs you something you were sure you couldn't survive losing, trust that a porch swing that's creaked faithfully since before you were born was the real inheritance all along. This story was written by a human, with AI as a companion. It was born from a simple wish, to awaken the belief that kindness still exists, and no matter how many trials life brings, there are always moments of justice and quiet miracles waiting for those who deserve them. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.